Well, more now on the efforts in the US to avoid the so-called fiscal cliff. Joining us now is Steve Keen, who is a professor of economics and finance at the University of Western Sydney in Australia. Steve Keen, how worried should we be about the impact of the fiscal cliff? I mean, the head of the IMF says the biggest single thing that could affect global economic growth is the fiscal cliff.
Well, I think it is a very large danger, but not because of the spending of the American government. It's more likely what the private sector is going to do in reaction to it. And what we're doing in this is quite possibly, unfortunately, repeating the same mistakes America made back during the Great Depression, when after the worst of it during 1932 to 34, when the economy appeared to be recovering, the government tried to rein in its own spending, the belief the crisis was over. And what actually happened was the private sector had stopped reducing its debt levels for a couple of years, but when the government stopped spending, it started to cut its debt levels again, and they fell back into the second depression, unemployment going from 12.5% then to 20% over a matter of just over 1 year. I'm afraid that's what the Americans are going to trigger, and the fiscal cliff really is something they shouldn't be worried about. They should be simply spending what the government needs to spend to counteract the lack of spending by the private sector.
So what you're saying then is if government spending is cut, that raises private debt, which many people say caused the problem in the first place.
Exactly. The crisis began when private sector debt, which is rising ridiculously faster than income for many, many decades, reached a peak and then started to fall. It fell from $42 trillion to $38 trillion. The government's increase in spending, which is much smaller, we're talking from about $6 trillion to $14 trillion, but from a far smaller level, that increase in spending counteracted the private sector reducing its debt, and the private sector has been stationary for about almost 2 years now. Now, if the government reduces its spending and cuts the income going to the private sector may be re-encouraged to start reducing its debt once more, and they could knock off $1 or $2 trillion as a result of that through bankruptcy and paying debt down deliberately. And that could take a huge chunk of demand out of the American economy, and that is what happened in 1937 to 1939.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point you make. I mean, economists are warning that if the full effects of the fiscal cliff are allowed to take hold, the resulting reduction in consumer spending could spark a new recession. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. And it could spark it mainly to what it does, not just a demand from people out of their income, but demand that comes out of changing levels of private debt. Because total spending in an economy is income plus the change in that debt. Now, because there's been no change in private debt for 2 years, income in America and demand has been fairly stationary and rising a bit, giving us a bit of a recovery. But if this fiscal cliff trick causes, say, about a $500 billion fall in government spending, that could trigger up to about a $2 trillion fall in private sector debt finance spending, and that could really bring us back to the worst of the 2007-2008 crisis very, very rapidly.
Yeah, let me get a final thought from you. I mean, if the fiscal squeeze does push the US into recession, I mean, what sort of global impact is that likely to have, especially in, in your region?
Well, there is. We actually, of course, make most of our money by selling iron ore and coal to China, that on sells it to the rest of the world. And we're already looking at a decline in our terms of trade here, and a small fall so far in the volume of exports. So that could cascade back onto us. But of course, we have this perverse situation as well, where our currency is regarded as a safe haven, even in these circumstances. So our dollar should continue rising, which would be, I think, doubly counterproductive. But it certainly would mean that one of the few sources of growth of demand in the global economy would disappear, leaving only the internal demand of the BRIC economies, and we can't rely upon economy 1/3 or 1/4 the size of America to cause the globe to grow as fast as it was back in the early 2000s.
All right, Steve Keen, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.